Standard 17 is how to apply geography to interpret the past. Geographers and historians agree that the human story must be told within the context of three intertwined points of view: space, the environment, and chronology. To Karl Sauer, the father of modern geography, although not so modern anymore, he lived and worked in the early and mid-1900s. A landscape and the cultures in it could only be understood if all of its influences through history were taken into account: the physical, the cultural, economic, political, and environmental. In 1927, Karl Sauer wrote the article Recent Developments in Cultural Geography, which considered how cultural landscapes are made up of the forms superimposed on the physical landscape. The geographically informed person understands the importance of bringing spatial and environmental focus of geography to bear on the events of history and vice versa, and the value of learning about the geographies of the past. We'll explore in turn space, environment, and chronology in this standard. This slide is about space. It's the first of the three intertwined points of view we're going to explore. Space, or place, is to geographers what time or chronology is to historians. Geography is the where, and the how, and the why. For example, as we look at space, we think about where, from where, or to where, when we're considering something like migration patterns, for example. Who occupied the space? Who colonized it? Who fought over it? What was the built environment like? The study of historical geography, then, requires that the beliefs and attitudes of the peoples of past historic periods regarding the environment in which they dwelled, human migration patterns, land use patterns, and especially people's own rights and privileges versus those of others are considered. Likewise, the study of history without these rich geographical and environmental contexts is one-dimensional. Understanding the geographies of past times, therefore, is as important as understanding the geography of the present, and both will help guide us to a better understanding of the geography of the future. Our second point of view is environment. For example, the environment could be natural and cultural landscapes. It's also diverse ecosystems. It's also about the growth and expansion of urban areas. Historical geographic information can be obtained through the study of what geographers call the built landscape, which means the remnant of past buildings and other structures. These human-made structures offer clues to what occurred, why they occurred, and even how people felt about them. A careful geographical analysis of today's cultural and physical landscapes is a valuable resource for learning about the past, which we will see in Standard 18 will help us build a better future. Historical geographies carry important messages for the world today. Earth is a giant stage for the events of human history. It is complex and has been occupied or acted on over and over by generations of people, each of which has tried to make the best of what Earth has provided. Physical and human interaction on this great geographic stage has created the contexts in which history has unfolded. What are the cross-cutting themes and issues that you begin to see between space, environment, and then chronology? Slide 4 talks about chronology, shedding light on the past. Some sub-themes in chronology are memory, or selective recall, subjectivity. How does one person recall an event? How does another person recall that same event? History, political and economic history, media history. What does the press tell us? Public history. What do the newspapers tell us? Public lectures and talks. Personal history, what really happened. And relics, what are the artifacts of history that can help explain it? What are the traditions, the norms, the mores of a particular time period? As mentioned earlier, if we understand geography, we can better understand history. By exploring what the world was like and how people and cultures perceived situations or events in a given place at a given time, the geographically informed person is able to interpret major historical issues. From the book, The Past is a Foreign Country, published in 1985, David Lowenthal writes, "We feel quite sure that the past really happened. Its traces and memories reflect undeniable scenes and acts. The airy and insubstantial future may never arrive. Man or nature may destroy humanity. Times as we know it may end. By contrast, the past is tangible and secure. People think of it as fixed, unalterably, indelibly recorded. How much nicer to go back," exclaims a fictional modern visitor to the world of 1820. "The past was safe. We are at home in it because it is our home. The past is where we came from." And few have not wished on occasion to return to an earlier time. One of the greatest themes in the history of the United States is migration. Past, present, and future. Today's migration is, of course, shaping the future. Individuals can retrace the space their ancestors occupied in the United States. Can you trace your family's migration history? When did your ancestors migrate to the United States? Were they always here? From where did they come? Why did they come here? In the United States, did your ancestors settle in one spot for a while? Did they move elsewhere? From where to where, and why? What memories do you have, or do your relatives have about their family and their culture of origin, and any present-day ties to the old country? Are there traditions, tools, cuisines, or other cultural traits that your family still embraces from the past? Some large and regional scale movements in the United States that help us understand the past better are these four: the colonization of the 13 original colonies, the westward movement, the Great Black Migration northward, movement out of the Dust Bowl, and we can even think of today's present-day immigration. What will today's actions tell us about the future? In this slide, we see the westward expansion out of the 13 original colonies and the eastern portion of the United States. There are several important routes in the 19th century between 1804 and 1870 that explored and settled much of the rest of the United States. On this map, we see in blue Lewis and Clark's Trail between 1804 and 1806. In purple, we see the Santa Fe Trail, 1821. The green line shows us the Oregon Trail from 1841 and beyond. The brown line shows us the Pony Express from 1860 onward. And the red line shows us the Transcontinental Railroad from 1869 and onward. Also on this map, we see the eras during which the 48 continental states gained statehood. As a side note, Arizona received its statehood about 100 years ago in 1912. In this slide of the Great Black Migration northward, we see maps, photographs, and paintings of what that migration was like. There are two maps. The map in the upper left corner illustrates the migration paths of blacks out of the south and to the north and to the west during the 1900s. The map in the bottom right shows the migration or the diffusion of blues music, which accompanied the people, the black artists, and the black listeners on their journey to the North. The Great Migration began in the 1910s and continued through World War II in the 1940s. During this 30-year time period, hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved from the South to the North. Many of these folks had worked as sharecroppers, tenant farmers, or as day laborers in the South. With the beginning of World War I, jobs opened in northern industrial cities around the Great Lakes. Businesses increased production to meet wartime needs, and because many white men joined the armed forces, many African American men and women migrated to the north to fill these positions. Estimates vary, but more than 1.5 million people made the journey north in this period. The migration north still continued into the 1970s, and another 5 million blacks moved to the north as well. What is interesting about this slide is that the map shows us a reverse migration of blacks who grew up in the North in the mid-1900s with their families. Now, in the 21st century and late 20th century, they're taking the opportunity to move back south. It's a fascinating cultural and historical geographic pattern or movement that ultimately gives rise to a counter-movement. During the Great Migration of the earlier part of the 20th century, push and pull factors served to push blacks out of the rural South, where farming and sharecropping jobs were becoming scarce, and at the same time they were pulled to the North because of industrial or manufacturing jobs opening up in the North. Why do you suppose we're now seeing a reverse migration, with some black Americans going back south? Another migration in U.S. history occurred simultaneously with the early part of the Great Black Migration to the North. In this map, we see the migration out of the Central Plains states, mostly westward, during the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s, the biggest environmental disaster in the history of the United States. What does each of these migrations of the past century tell us about this country's past? What can we learn about the present and about the future from these migrations and events? Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself. That's a question taken up in Standard 18. So, how did the Dust Bowl migrants get to California? The only major highway leading into the breadbasket of California and the road of choice for many migrants during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s was, of course, Route 66. Cities along Route 66 and cities in California affected by the influx of migrants were Denver, Topeka, Oklahoma City, Austin, Santa Fe, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Sacramento, to name a few. Some places or highways in this case are iconic, and what we find about these highways gives us a sense of, well, our history and our geography. The part of America that Route 66 passes through, and has passed through for generations, is a piece of the American identity. Follow Route 66 on a map. Connect the dots, the cities. Do any of these places along the route give you a sense of the American culture? What makes Arizona, Arizona? Is it our ancient past, with our various Indian tribes? Is it the territorial period, the period in which Arizona became a state? Is it modern Arizona of the 20th century? Or is it Arizona at 100 years old, as it will be next year in 2012? Sometimes we hear that Arizona is the state of cowboys, Indians, cacti, and the Grand Canyon. Or we hear sometimes the 5 C's of Arizona are our foundation as a state: cactus, citrus, copper, cattle, and climate. What else can we think about that defines or identifies Arizona as a particular place? What are its physical characteristics? What are more of its cultural characteristics? Its demographics, its population, its politics? What sets Arizona apart from other places? In 2012, Arizona celebrates its 100th anniversary as the 48th state admitted to the state union. How did we get where we are? Where did we come from? What put Arizona on the map? In these photos and old postcards, we see how people have interacted with their environment to transform both the cultural and the physical environment around them. The town of Bisbee, Arizona, in this example, we see how generations of inhabitants, established residents, and newcomers alike created and recreated the cultural and physical landscapes of Bisbee. We see change over time. We see evolution. We see the change in revenues and economies of Bisbee. We see the decline of a mining community, and we see the rise of a community out of dereliction and neglect. For sure, we see changing community identity all around us. Students must appreciate that viewing the past from both spatial and chronological points of view can lead us to a greater awareness and depth of understanding of both physical and human events, and it is an essential ingredient in the interpretation of the world today. This presentation was done by Elizabeth Larson, Lecturer, School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning, Arizona State University, 2011.